the Transvaal, South Africa, 1880. You're in a good mood as the army marches through the South African veldt. It's almost Christmas, the band is playing, and your general has assured you that this will be a cakewalk. The Boer farmers of the Transvaal have risen in revolt, but they will be no match for the soldiers of Her Majesty's army. Then you hear the colonel riding in front shout, "My God, look there!" The band stops playing as a large Boer force appears up ahead. A solitary Boer rides up under a white flag and hands a letter to your general. You can't hear what is said, but when General Anstruther returns to the column, his face is grave. Suddenly, blood splatters across your face as the soldier next to you collapses to the ground with a hole in his head, a stunned expression on his face. Seemingly thousands of bullets rake the army like angry bees, and chaos breaks out. All around you, men are falling dead. The wounded lay moaning on the floor. You try to return fire, but your marksmanship has always been poor. You're certain you haven't hit a Boer. Then a bullet smashes into your thigh, closely followed by a second that hits your shoulder. As the lethally aimed bullets keep pouring in, you can only think, this was meant to be easy. How can ignorant farmers fight so well? I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
Da was uns ausgebildet. Wollen diese 4 Jahre nützen.
Hello everyone, welcome to the show. Britain often suffers military disasters, but we rarely lose wars. That's probably why the First Boer War has been forgotten in popular memory, with the exception of Afrikaners, as it was such an humiliation. Overshadowed by the more famous Second Boer War, Britain lost every battle to an opponent it sneered at and looked down upon. As in ancient Greek legend, hubris inevitably led to nemesis, and a battered British army was left wondering how it had been defeated so badly. Our story starts with the arrival of the Dutch East India Company in South Africa. They controlled the lucrative spice trade with Asia, and before the Suez Canal opened, the best route to take was round the Cape of Good Hope. They established a colony at today's Cape Town in the 17th century to act as a reprovisioning stop for their ships, and generally just to protect their interests in the area. First, they struggled to find people who were willing to uproot their lives and head to far-off South Africa. It wasn't the easiest sell, but just like the early days of the American colonies, they were stayed by those fleeing religious persecution. Protestants from France and Germany arrived, mixed in with some Dutch settlers, the mixture that would create the people we know today as Afrikaners. Living on a harsh and violent frontier, they prospered, but also began to become their own distinct people. A new language emerged, a mixture of Dutch, French, German, and with African native words thrown in, what would become modern-day Afrikaans. These settlers were hardy, deeply religious, suspicious of government, had a deep love of personal liberty, and a fear and hatred of the local natives, and the name they would be given would be the Boers. The name literally just means farmer. Imagine a people with the dress sense and religious fervour of the Amish, but also amazing fighters and crack shots. During the Napoleonic Wars, Britain would occupy and then annex the Cape Colony. As a new maritime empire par excellence, it was vital to protecting the route to India. In doing so, it inherited the Boers as well. From the start, it was a tense and often hostile relationship. The Boers grumbled about this new foreign empire trying to tax them, tell them what to do, and especially trying to take away their African slaves. On the British side, they looked down on the Boers with a real sense of disdain. General Wolseley claimed they were the most ignorant white people in the world. They are given to more tall talk than the Americans, but at heart they are cowards. They know they could not stand up against our troops for an hour. Rather ironic, considering how badly this war went for the British. H. Rider Haggard, the future author of King Solomon's Mines, particularly hated them, claiming, "The men were ugly, while the women tended to get very stout as they grow older. The typical Boer has no education and does not care that his children receive any. He has no romance in him, nor any of the higher feelings and aspirations that are found in almost every other race." Even Queen Victoria got in on the Boer hating, writing that the Boers are a horrid people, cruel and overbearing. A common British joke was that a Boer asked if he could see England from Cape Town. For the British, the Boers were a crude race of country bumpkins. This is partly why the racism of the Boers shocked them so much. The British were no shrinking violets when it came to treating black Africans poorly, but they objected to the open use of slavery and unrepentant Boer white supremacy. Even then, some finesse was required. That the Boers didn't care about this rubbed the British up the wrong way. Perhaps unsurprisingly, these two peoples couldn't live together. Starting in the 1830s, 12,000 Boers left the Cape Colony on the epic Great Trek into the African interior. They would found their own states, most famously the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, while the British seemed happy to see them gone. In their new home, the average Boer lived in complete isolation on ranches of 6,000 acres or more, read their Bibles, tended their cattle, and reared their huge families. Their boys were accomplished horsemen by the age of 6, and crack rifle marksmen by the time they were 12. They may have been the toughest pioneers in all of history. Yet, this cosy situation would change when huge reserves of diamonds were discovered under Boer land. Britain suddenly became interested in these states it had previously ignored, starting off by annexing the main diamond mining area of Kimberley. With advancing Britain unnerving the Boers, they also faced brutal wars with the Zulus and the Pedi. Under threat from without, the Transvaal in particular was also weakening from the inside. The Transvaal had been founded in the first place because the Boers hated the rules and taxes of the British. Now, though, they turned that same defiance against their own government at Pretoria. They wouldn't pay their taxes. The state was bankrupt, while their leaders only fought among themselves. It's rather like what happened to the Confederacy during the American Civil War. After being founded on the doctrine of states' rights, it proved an Achilles heel to fighting a war for national survival. Taking advantage, the British swooped in and annexed the Transvaal. A cable was sent by the British commander claiming, "The great majority of the Boers welcome change." This was an optimistic assessment. At best, there was a surly acceptance. Britain did little to endear itself to its newest subjects. There was rampant corruption in the new administration, high taxes, and the former Parliament building was turned into a social club for the British elites. I can't understand why the Boers were upset. Britain's man on the spot was Sir Bartle Frere, also known as Bottle Beer to his critics, who soon concluded that all the unrest in the white colonies was being stirred up by the Zulus. That's the kind of analysis that would turn South Africa into a repeated bloodbath for Britain. In no time at all, he picked a fight with the Zulus, and the Redcoats were on the march. Like all of Britain's South African wars, it started with gross overconfidence and then became a bloody slog. 1,000 British soldiers were slaughtered at Isandlwana, one of the greatest humiliations in the history of the Empire. While victory would later come at Yolandi, the whole affair actually further undermined British rule in the Transvaal. The threat the Zulus posed had been the major reason why the grumbling of the Boers had been kept to a low background hum. Now, suddenly, this had been removed. At the same time, Isandlwana had shown the British could be beaten, that they weren't as invincible as they claimed to be. Repeated missions were sent to London asking for a lighter hand in ruling and a return to independence. Instead, they found out Britain was thinking of federating South Africa to tidy things up, rather like they had just done in Canada. The Boers faced being submerged in a greater Anglo-Saxon-dominated South Africa. War might still have been avoided with a diplomatic, sensitive and skilled governor of the Transvaal. It was Britain's luck that instead it had Sir William Owen Lanyon. The Boers were convinced that because of his swarthy complexion and the fact he had commanded black troops in the West India Regiment, he was partly black himself. They wondered too about the fact that he was 37 years old and unmarried, unnatural in their eyes. Lanyon despised the Boers right back. He was only interested in screwing as much tax money out of them as possible. He freely admitted that he expected to stay single for a while because a Boer wife would almost surely be, quote, flabby, limp and draggle-tailed, end quote. It may surprise you, but this didn't go down well with the Boers. It would only take a spark for a conflict to begin. Inevitably, it would be over taxes. The trouble began at Potchefstroom, where a farmer named Piet Bezuidenhout challenged an order to pay back taxes amounting to a little more than £27. He proved in court that he owed no more than £14. The Landrust, or the town magistrate, agreed, and then ordered the farmer to pay the £14 plus £13 in court costs, putting him right back where he started. Having dealt with local bureaucracy before, I can feel his pain. Acting on his lawyer's advice, Bezuidenhout refused to pay the costs. In retaliation, the Landrust seized one of his ox wagons and announced it would be put up for public auction at 11 a.m. on November the 11th, 1880, in the public square. Just a note going forward, the Boers often described the British as roonecks or rednecks, allegedly because they were unused to the climate, so the back of their necks would turn red from the sun. So remember, rooneck means a Brit. The crowd is silent, but radiates with sullen anger. The sheriff doesn't seem to notice, or maybe pretends not to, as he starts the auction. We are here in the name of Her Majesty Queen Victoria to auction off this ox cart to pay a debt owed to the Crown. You tune him out as your fellow Boers grumble. These British have been sent by the devil himself. They're always demanding more of your money. Taxes for this, taxes for that, always taxes. always interfering. Don't they understand that every Boer is a king on his own land, answerable only to God? Then your neighbour, Piet Cronje, leaps up onto the wagon, grabs the sheriff, kicks him, and shouts, "Away with you, you government officials! We don't acknowledge you!" The crowd cheers and starts shouting, "Runek's out! Runek's out!" Oxen are attached to the wagon. Then, as one, you move off, still cheering and firing your guns into the air. The sheriff can only look on with a mixture of bewilderment and fear. Blithely unaware of the danger, Lanyon told Lord Kimberley, the colonial minister, that, quote, "I do not anticipate that any serious trouble would arise out of the affair." But even as the message was being sent, more than 4,000 Boers were massing. Rifles were oiled and bandoliers jammed with cartridges at a place called Paardekraal, where they established a new government. 3 men were chosen to lead them: Martinus Pretorius, Piet Joubert, and the soon-to-be legendary Paul Kruger. To show their solidarity in their own traditional way, each Boer picked up a small stone and threw it onto a larger heap. As Kruger plays such a massive role in Boer history, and the Boer Wars in particular, let's quickly delve into this fascinating and often bizarre life. Born Stephanus Johannes Paulus Kruge, often anglicised as Paul Kruger, he was a Boer's Boer. He had little formal education and saw no reason to rectify this, content to read only the Bible and pronounce that the world was definitely flat. Yet he was also extremely tough. He had been fighting on the frontier since the age of 10 and was an excellent shot. Famously, at the age of 20, he was out hunting rhinos when his elephant gun blew up in his face. His thumb was almost completely blown off. What was left of it, he then cut off with his own knife. When it became infected with gangrene, he stuffed it into an open goat's stomach, an old Boer recipe. Despite, or maybe because, of this cure, he somehow survived. A fanatical Calvinist, he rejected dancing, singing, and plays as products of the devil, and even started his own church, the Dopplers. All in all, he was a curious combination of Oliver Cromwell and Ian Paisley. In another life, I can very much imagine him as one of Cromwell's Ironsides. Yet, he was also an excellent general and politician. He would become Britain's greatest opponent in South Africa. Because there was no printing press in Paardekraal, the Boers descended on Potchefstroom, where there was a press, to publish their Declaration of Independence. However, they found 200 British soldiers there on a mission to enforce the tax laws. The Boers rode right up to their little fort and jeered at the British garrison. "Why don't you fight, you damned cowards?" while the Boers shouted in English. A small detachment of mounted infantry rode out to confront the Boers. Shots were fired, and the war began. Lanyon showed how truly disconnected he was from the very people he was meant to be ruling, frantically cabling that, "I cannot conceive what can have so suddenly caused the Boers to act as they have." With the Transvaal in open revolt, the British position was weaker than anyone knew. Due to cost savings, troops had been withdrawn from South Africa. There were only about 1,700 soldiers in the whole Transvaal, scattered in small garrisons all over the place. The only available cavalry regiment, the King's Dragoon Guards, had been transferred just as the trouble was breaking out. This left the British with no experienced mounted troops to face the best sharpshooting mounted infantry in the world. Even worse, when the Dragoon Guards had transferred, their horses had been sold to guess who? That's right, the Boers. Just to truly set up a disaster in the making, most of the available troops were pretty terrible. These were not the cream of Queen Victoria's army. They were poorly trained, poorly led, and so constantly bored by garrison duty that desertion was a real problem. Perhaps their worst trait was that their marksmanship was incredibly poor, especially compared to the Boers. They would fire thousands of rounds from their state-of-the-art Martini Henry rifles in this war, and hardly ever hit anyone. Maybe an inspired general could have still led even these troops to victory. And Britain seemed to have this in Major General Sir George Pomeroy Colley. He was something of a prodigy and was seen as the smartest man in the British Army. Like so many of Britain's generals, he was born into an Anglo-Irish family. Entering the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst at 13, he began his rapid rise to the top. Demonstrating a natural aptitude for military theory, Colley amazed his instructors and fellow officers by completing the entire 2-year course in less than 10 months, while still earning the highest marks recorded up to that time. Something of a Renaissance man, he also painted, played the flute, wrote poetry, and spoke multiple languages. For the complete package, he was married to a beautiful and much younger woman. All in all, he was the kind of seemingly perfect man that must have driven his fellow officers crazy. Yet this strategic genius would lose every battle he fought in this war. How could this happen? For those prepared to look, there were 3 big cracks in his perfect facade. Firstly, he had spent most of his career as either a secretary or assistant to other commanders. For all his brilliance, he had never held a field command. Secondly, like most of the British, he grossly underestimated the Boers. He should have known better. He had actually gone out on a patrol with a Boer commando unit, basically a militia. Yet he seems to have learnt the wrong lessons. Camp discipline was amusing, he wrote. One example he cited was when, quote, "The bugle sounded, lights out. A field cornet," basically a Boer officer, "on duty, passing a wagon with a light in it, calls out, 'Now then, put out that light there.' Answer from within, 'If you want to put this light out, you better bring a precious big stick with you.'" End quote. Colley saw only that the Boers were not organised and disciplined like a proper European army. He didn't notice what great shots they were, and how years of fighting and hunting had made them lethal on home territory. Finally, despite his brilliance, he had a tendency to almost freeze under pressure at key moments. When tasked to argue the case in the Tau Province Parliament for more powers for the British governor, he rose to his feet, drew in a deep breath, and choked. Not a word. He stammered. He mumbled. His eyes bulged. But he couldn't think of a word to say. Similar behaviour would occur throughout this war. Colley did take prompt action at the start of the campaign. He ordered all the garrisons in the Transvaal to send troops to Pretoria without delay. However, the commander of the garrison at Lydenburg, Lieutenant Colonel Philip Robert Anstruther, didn't seem to understand the urgency of the situation. Most of his wagons had been sold as a cost-cutting measure, so he had to borrow carts from local farmers, which admittedly wasn't his fault. However, he didn't just collect the regulation 10 to 12 carts needed. He instead wasted 8 days collecting 34 carts. Maybe if these had held vital military supplies, he could be forgiven, but they were mainly for his personal effects. Already behind schedule, this large wagon convoy finally lumbered forward, made up of 9 officers, 254 rank and file, 60 Africans to drive the carts and manage the oxen, and 3 women and 2 children. It was not a force that could go anywhere fast. They only managed to travel at best about 9 miles a day. Things got worse as it rained, leading to swollen river crossings and muddy trails. Soon they were lucky to cover as little as 3 miles a day. All this delay gave the Boers ample time to prepare an ambush. And Strufer also completely discounted the Boer threat. He didn't rate them in the slightest. Historian John Landon describes him as, quote, bluff, good-natured and unfussed, with an amiable contempt for the Boers, whose ability to take strong concerted action he completely discounted. End quote. He seemed to believe that the Boers were cowards with no stomach for a fight, even saying, quote, they will turn tail at the first beat of the big drum, end quote, referring to the big drum in his 30-man regimental band in which he took such pride. As this slowly moving convoy marches through the Transvaal, with its band playing, of course, and Strufer is being constantly warned by sympathetic locals that the Boers are planning an ambush, but he ignores every warning. He was so overconfident that he is barely even sending out scouts to check the route ahead. Still only halfway to Pretoria, they stopped off at a local farmhouse. The Boer owner put on a smiling face, but secretly he was backing the rebels. While feeding Strufer and his officers a fine breakfast, he reassured them that if they saw an armed Boer riding around, they were not to worry. They were completely friendly. And Strufer, unbelievably, fell for this. His soldiers, meanwhile, denied breakfast, filled up on ripe peaches from the farmer's orchard, and stuffed their pockets with more to eat on the long march. It was an almost festive atmosphere as they marched, with the band belting out their favourite tunes. That band, though, would come back to haunt the convoy. It was made up of 40 men who, as they were playing their instruments, were completely unarmed. Their weapons were stashed at the back of the convoy, so out of 254 soldiers, 40 are unarmed, with no easy way of getting their guns. To make matters worse, the troops had been issued 30 rounds of ammunition instead of the standard 70. The lids of the reserve boxes of ammunition hadn't been unscrewed, and this would be devilishly difficult to do under fire. Only 4 scouts were being used, 2 at the front and 2 at the back. Not nearly enough. Despite this, one scout did report back that he thought he saw armed Boers ahead, and Strufer had a quick glance using his binoculars, then declared the scout was wrong and must have seen cows instead. When the scout replied that he didn't know many cows that carried rifles and wore clothes, he was told to mind his own business. Even before the Boers attacked, this was a convoy of the damned. There is little more Strufer could have done if he had actually wanted to cause a military disaster. As in the opening dramatisation, they ran into the Boer army. The letter Strufer was handed was written in English, warning him that the Boers had now formed a republic and that any advance into their territory by British troops would be considered a declaration of war. And Struve refused to abandon his mission to reach Pretoria. Riding back to his soldiers, he seemed to think the Boers would give him time to get his men in fighting order, as there was still no sense of urgency. Instead, they opened fire, and the devastation began. You are a 17-year-old Boer, following your elders as you prepare for the ambush. You've been shooting and hunting since you were 10, but this is the first time you'll be fighting human prey. Your heart beats fast. A mixture of fear and excitement grips you. An old Boer with a big white beard turns around and yells at you. "Stop daydreaming, Jan. The Roonecks will be here soon. You must get in position." While one group blocks the road, your commando's job is to hide behind a dip beside the road to ambush the British. You can hear the Roonecks band playing as they approach, but you're currently having to crawl through sharp brambles that rip at your clothes and skin. Finally in position, but still in pain from the brambles, you await the order to fire. The British in their red uniforms are perfect targets, standing out magnificently against the African veldt. The older Boer whispers, "Now, take the officers first." Taking careful aim so every shot counts, just like when you are hunting, you pull the trigger and see one of the Brits' heads rock back and then his body fall to the floor. Quickly reloading, you fire again and again. The Roonecks aren't even using the carts for cover, so it's like shooting fish in a barrel. The band drop their instruments and try to run to the last wagon in the convoy. Not a single one gets there as you send a hail of bullets their way. You can see their general trying to establish order, his body jerking as bullets hit him. Finally, he sinks to the floor. The Roonecks start waving white handkerchiefs. They're surrendering. You've won. Today, you feel like you could take on the whole British Empire on your own, brambles and all. Known as the Battle of Bronkhorstbrug, in just 10 minutes, 5 officers and 63 men were killed, while 4 officers and 85 men were wounded. Dead and dying men, horses and oxen, were strewn all about, and there were pools of blood in the white road. Every British officer was either dead or severely wounded. The Boer casualties were just 2 dead, 4 wounded. The low casualties for the Boers were due to the appalling marksmanship and the fact that the sights of the British guns were set too high. They kept shooting over the Boers when they fired back, just to show how good the Boer marksmanship was. The average number of wounds for the British was 5 per man. A Private Duffy, who lived to fight another day, had 18 holes in him, where bullets had either entered or exited. So devastating had the Boers' rifle fire been, that the British assumed there had been at least 1,500 of them. Actually, there was only about 200. Colonel Struve died 6 days later. He'd been shot 5 times, mostly in the legs. The soldiers were buried where they died, and because their pockets and haversacks were still filled with peaches, peach trees grew from their graves, eventually becoming, one officer who returned to the battlefield years later said, uncommonly fine orchards. While the British called it a massacre and couldn't understand how it had happened, really it had been due to the fighting prowess of the Boers, and even more to the staggering overconfidence of Struve. I have to admit, when I first read about him dismissing the scouts' sightings of Boers as being cows, I literally shouted out, Oh, come on, you idiot. I then had to explain to Mrs. Forgotten Wars what I was so worked up about. I don't think she was impressed. The first battle of the campaign had been a disaster, yet for all the stupidity involved, the upcoming battles would be even worse for the British. Still, the war would continue. On January the 6th, 1881, Queen Victoria, in her speech from the throne, said, "A rising in the Transvaal has recently imposed upon me the duty of taking military measures with a view to the prompt vindication of my authority, and has of necessity set aside for the time any plan for securing to the European settlers that full control over their local affairs, without prejudice to the interests of the natives, which I had been desirous to confirm." This was actually a lie. Britain had no intention of allowing self-rule for the Transvaal. Any lingering trust of the British was most certainly gone now among the Boer leadership. The remaining British garrisons in the Transvaal were now under siege, while a large Boer force invaded Natal province to fortify a low-lying 6-mile-long spur of the Drakensberg Mountains that blocked the way from Natal into the Transvaal. It would be up to Colley to save Britain's blushes, but was he up to the job? Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like, subscribe, leave a review, or tell a friend. In our next episode, the British suffer further devastating defeats at Lang Nek and Ingogo. Join me for a tale of incompetence, heroism, and how not to fight a war in South Africa. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.